You know how it is, just walking around a city. You're constantly seeing these, well, crazy juxtapositions, aren't you?
Hmm.
Massive wealth right next door to real poverty,
Mm.
buildings, designed to stand for centuries, and then something else that looks like it was built to be chucked away next week.
Yeah, disposable culture meets ancient stone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can either like really pay attention to all of it or just completely tune it out. Sometimes you might even manage a wry smile at the absurdity or try to find some kind of logic in it all.
It makes you wonder how people processed that centuries ago.
Well, it strikes me that this way of observing the urban experience isn't exactly new. It actually has echoes all the way back in ancient Rome, specifically in the work of the epigrammatist Martial.
Oh, Marshall, right.
Hmm.
What's fascinating is how he, living in the, vibrant, chaotic heart of Imperial Rome, captured those very same contrasts and the social games they revealed, all in his short, punchy
Yeah,
poems.
the epigram.
And we've got a collection of really insightful scholarly analyses that help us unpack just how sure his observations on Roman society actually were.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we're going to immerse ourselves in the world of Martial and his epigrams. Our aim is to really get a feel for Roman urban life, how people interacted, what they aspired to socially, even how they consumed what passed for media back then.
Right. Sort of like their version of scrolling through a feed, maybe.
Possibly. All through Marshall's often surprising and, let's be honest, always witty little poems, we'll be looking at themes like trying to climb the social ladder, Rome's obsession with public spectacles, and even, the beginnings of literary culture as we know it.
Sounds great. Where should we start?
Okay, so let's dive in, starting with something really fundamental, how people navigated the complex social rules of the time.
Right. Well, one thing that really stands out in the analysis is Marshall's talent for revealing the often unspoken expectations that governed Roman society, particularly this strong sense among the elite that favors should be returned. Reciprocity.
The quid pro quo.
Exactly. He just lays bare this system, which was so essential for maintaining your social standing. It wasn't always explicitly stated, but, everyone understood the game.
It's interesting to compare this with someone like Pliny the Younger, another writer from around the same period.
Hmm.
The sources point out that Pliny often uses this very elegant language, talking about merit and genuine friendship. But it seems that this might have been a way of actually sort of obscuring the underlying power dynamics.
That's a key point in the scholarship, yeah. Pliny masks the expected returns on investing in those relationships. It wasn't always about pure friendship, was it?
Doesn't sound like it.
Precisely. The analysis suggests that Pliny seemed quite, anxious about maintaining his social position and his networks of influence. Martial, on the other hand, he appears to have had a different approach. He seems to choose when he'll participate in the polite social fictions and, when he'll just expose the more transactional realities underneath. It suggests a much less anxious mental landscape for Martial. He's almost winking at the reader, isn't he? Acknowledging the absurdity of it all.
Yeah, it's like Marshall is holding up a mirror to society and saying, come on, we all know what's really going on here. There's a great example cited, Epigram 5.73,
Oh, yeah, that one.
where Marshall points out that when you ask someone about their latest project, it is definitely not an invitation for you to immediately launch into a lengthy description of your own thing.
Huh. Still true today.
Totally. It's one of those unwritten social rules that we all, intuitively understand but rarely actually talk about.
And that's a perfect illustration of Marshall's style, isn't it? He takes these everyday, seemingly minor interactions and just reveals the underlying social mechanisms at play.
Okay, so that's the social rules.
Hmm.
Now, what about climbing the ladder? Social mobility, that seems like a big theme too.
Oh, absolutely. And he captures it so well. Yeah. Let's consider another fascinating aspect, this desire for social mobility.
This comes through really clearly in that poem about Cerdo, right? This guy described as the king of the cobblers who puts on a gladiatorial combat.
Yeah, Cerdo. A munis, a big public show, that kind of thing was usually associated with the well-established elite. It was a classic way to try and buy status, basically.
Right, converting cash into cachet.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is how Marshall uses wordplay to completely undermine Cerdo's attempt to translate his newfound wealth into social standing, what the scholars call trying to acquire symbolic capital.
How does he do that?
Well, Cerdo's Greek name means prophet, for starters, and Marshall just runs with it. He cleverly links the cobbler's awl, the subula, to a dagger, a sika, and the animal hide corium that Cerdo works with. He links that to the gladiator skin.
Oof. Subtle but brutal.
It's a subtle but really effective way of keeping Cerdo in his place through language. He's basically saying you can't escape your origins that easily.
So it's like Marhel is suggesting that Cerdo's money, which, came from working with animal hides, is just being directly swapped for the literal hides of gladiators. There's no real transformation into something more, well, respectable in elite eyes.
Exactly. It's a very literal transaction he's highlighting. The poem uses these puns on skin and hide to metaphorically keep Cerdo stuck at the level of his raw materials, his cobbler identity.
And that line about him playing at his own expense and giving a gladiatorial combat with his own hide.
Right. It's both literal, he's footing the bill himself, and metaphorical. He's potentially risking his existing social standing by trying to overreach.
And the punchline.
The final lines tell him to keep himself in his own skin. It really reinforces this idea of staying within your socially prescribed boundaries. The key insight here, I think, is that in Roman society, wealth alone wasn't enough, was it? There were unspoken rules and symbolic barriers that even money couldn't easily overcome.
It's quite cutting, really. And the analysis also points out that Marshall himself is kind of doing something similar with his own poetry, using language strategically, both reflecting and policing these social boundaries.
That's a great point. He's both observer and participant in the system.
So what was the actual status of Marshall's poetry itself within Roman society? Was it seen as, high art or something else?
That's a really insightful question. And the sources suggest that Marshall's poetry occupied a rather, fluid and multifaceted space. It wasn't just one thing. It was his profession, how he made a living. It was a commercial product sold by booksellers like Tryphon. It was given as gifts. It served as a form of social obligation. You might write a poem for a patron, right?
Sure, makes sense.
It was entertainment. And for some, it might even have been seen as a bit of a triviality, nougat, as Marshall himself sometimes called it, trifles.
So it wasn't this revered high art form that was completely separate from everyday life. It was right there in the mix.
Precisely. Mixed in with all the other aspects of Roman urban existence, it had practical functions. And this creates an interesting tension.
How so?
Well, while individual epigrams might be written for specific occasions or people very ephemeral, Marshall clearly also had a desire for his collected books to have a more lasting value, to transcend their immediate use. He wanted his work to endure,
Right. The analysis mentions Luke Roman's idea about this.
Yeah.
This fragmentation of Marshall's work into all these individual social situations, but also Marshall's underlying concern for the book as a complete integral thing.
Exactly. Roman argues he wanted both the immediate social impact and the long-term literary recognition.
And Roman links this tension to patronage.
Yes, he suggests it might be linked to the way patronage was dispersed in Marshall's time. Unlike, say, the Augustan era, with a powerful central patron like Maecenas, Marshall had to constantly cultivate many smaller gifts and social engagements to make a living. This undoubtedly influenced the occasional nature of his poetry. This interplay between the fleeting moment and the aspiration for lasting significance really seems to be a defining characteristic of Marshall's work.
So the key takeaway is that his poetry wasn't just art for art's sake. It was deeply embedded in the social and economic realities of its time.
Absolutely. It couldn't be separated.
That makes perfect sense. It brings to mind that epigram, 4.72, where this guy Quintus is essentially demanding Marshall's books, expecting them as a gift, maybe, or a personal dedication.
Yes, and Marshall's response is quite telling, isn't it? He claims he doesn't actually own any copies himself.
Which sounds a bit disingenuous.
Probably, but he says the bookseller Tryphon has them. And when Quintus balks at the idea of paying for what he dismissively calls trivialities, new guy,
Marshall basically says, yeah, they're trivialities, and I'm not paying for them either.
Exactly. He rarely agrees, nor will I. It's a very pointed refusal.
It's a complete flip on Catullus's famous poem, where he very generously offers his book, isn't it?
It is. Here, Quintus clearly thinks Marshall's poems aren't worth paying for. And Marshall cleverly uses the allusion to Catullus to suggest that if Quintus doesn't value his work enough to buy it, he's certainly not getting a free copy or a dedication.
The underlying message seems to be about the value of his labor, his craft.
And what's particularly interesting is how Marshall highlights the dual nature of the book. It's a literary work, sure, but it's also a physical object with a tangible material cost. Papyrus, ink, scribe time.
Right, production costs.
Even the author, it implies, has to pay to have copies made. By bringing in the bookseller Tryphon, Marshall firmly grounds his poetry in the commercial realities of its circulation. And it subtly hints at the diverse range of his readership, those who were willing to pay for his trivialities.
So the book itself is kind of a commodity.
In a way, yes. The key insight here is that in Roman literary culture, even poetry had a commodity value, and the author's relationship with his work and his audience was increasingly shaped by these economic realities.
This idea of commodification is really fascinating. It wasn't just books, though, was it? Even the epigram itself seems to have had a kind of transactional value. That anecdote about Augustus and the Greekling really illustrates this.
Absolutely. That story is fantastic. This Greekling, an individual Greek origin, kept trying to impress Emperor Augustus by presenting him with flattering Greek epigrams, short, witty verses.
Buttering him up.
Pretty much. Augustus, observing this persistent behavior, decided to play along. So he composed his own Greek epigram and sent it to the poet.
Okay. What happened?
The Greekling was apparently so impressed by the emperor's poetic skill that he immediately pulled out a few denarii Roman coins to pay Augustus, expressing regret that he couldn't offer more.
Huh. He tried to tip the emperor for a poem.
Essentially. And Augustus, clearly amused by this very direct exchange, then proceeds to pay the Greek an enormous sum.
Wow. It's a funny story, but like you said, it reveals quite a lot about the nature of epigrams, doesn't it?
It does indeed. It shows that the epigram, being concise, well-crafted, and ideally pleasing, was a literary form that could be readily commodified. The Greek's immediate offer of payment acknowledges the pleasure and value he received from Augustus's poem. It implicitly treats the epigram like a gift or service that warrants a reciprocal exchange.
Like a very early form of a tip for good artistic performance.
Exactly. The key takeaway here is that even brief literary forms like the epigram had an inherent value and could be seen as objects of exchange within Roman society.
It's like a proto-tweet with a built-in Venmo request.
Yeah.
And the sheer scale of Augustus's return payment. Okay, maybe exaggerated for comedic effect, but it really underscores this tension, doesn't it, between the idea of literary exchange as a purely artistic pursuit and the underlying commercial realities.
Absolutely. It highlights the significance of the fiction of reciprocity within literary circles, that delicate dance between genuine appreciation and, well, expected returns.
A balance between mystification art is magic. And demystification.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it still costs money.
Precisely. It's a nuanced balance. Now, shall we shift our focus a bit? Let's delve into another huge aspect of Roman life that Martial's work vividly portrays: the spectacle of the arena.
Ah, yes, the Liber Spectacularum, the Book of Spectacles, which I have to say specifically focuses on the events in the Roman arena, and it can be quite unsettling, even shocking to modern readers with its detailed descriptions of violence.
It really can be. It forces you to confront a very different sensibility, a different set of values entirely.
Yeah, the sheer brutality described can be jarring for us today, and it's no surprise that the Roman arena has played such a significant role in discussions about contemporary mass culture. That famous phrase, bread and circuses.
A classic example of what's sometimes called negative classicism, isn't it? Where we use a critical lens informed by classical examples to analyze potentially problematic aspects of modern entertainment and maybe social control.
The analysis we have suggests that early imperial Rome, much like how some commentators view our late capitalist societies, could be characterized as a society of the spectacle.
Yeah, a culture increasingly dominated by visual displays and public performances. Although Guy Debord, who famously coined the term society of the spectacle, did draw a distinction.
Between different types.
Yes, between the concentrated spectacle, like the Roman arena with its clear focus on a central figure of power, the emperor,
Right at the center.
and the diffuse spectacle of modern consumerism, which is more pervasive and less centrally controlled. The Roman arena, with the emperor's almost divine presence at its heart, definitely falls into that concentrated category. Submission to the emperor's power was intrinsically linked to engaging with and participating in the spectacle he provided.
So the arena wasn't just entertainment. It was a powerful tool for reinforcing imperial authority and social order.
Absolutely fundamental. And Martial's epigrams about these spectacles reveal some interesting strategies at play, particularly what the scholarship calls the omnivorousness of the spectacle and the concept of the simulacrum.
Okay, let's unpack those a bit. Omnivorousness. Sounds like it eats everything.
Kind of. It refers to the spectacle's tendency to absorb and reconfigure the entire world as spectacle, effectively blurring the lines between what happens inside the arena and what exists outside of it. Marshall's poems often present the amphitheater as a kind of self-contained microcosm.
Like a little world inside the walls.
Exactly. Capable of representing and consuming everything beyond its walls, bringing the world within its own carefully constructed reality.
Okay, and the simulacrum. That sounds familiar.
The idea of the image becoming a replacement for the original reality, a copy that might eventually lose its connection to what it initially represented.
So in the context of the arena,
This might relate to the way historical events or myths were reenacted and consumed purely as spectacle. They potentially lose their original meaning, their moral weight, maybe their historical power. It becomes about the performance itself, not the original story.
it's about the erosion of the authority of the original event or story, transforming its potential for instruction or inspiration into something primarily to be consumed for entertainment.
Precisely. Now, let's look at how Marshall portrays Rome and the wider Roman world within this framework of spectacle.
Speculum 3 really broadens this concept, doesn't it? By focusing on the foreign spectators who are drawn to Rome, specifically to witness these grand arena events. It wasn't just Romans attending.
That's key. And you have to understand the dual meaning inherent in the word spectator. It means both tourist, someone traveling to see a site, and observer, someone actively watching a performance.
So Rome becomes this global tourist destination, but the main attraction is the show.
Exactly. Rome isn't just another city to visit. Its primary attraction, its defining feature, has become the amphitheater, transforming it into a global destination specifically for spectatorship. People came from all corners of the empire to see the shows.
The poem gives this incredible list of diverse peoples making their way to Rome from the mythical Rhodopean Hemus region to Sarmatians, Egyptians, even people from distant Britain. It's like the arena becomes a miniature representation of the vast Roman Empire itself.
It really is. And what's particularly striking is that despite the varied voice of the people, so different languages and cultures, they achieve a kind of unity.
Wow.
Through their shared acclamation of Caesar, the emperor, as the true father of the fatherland. The analysis mentions the juxtaposition of Segambrian and Ethiopian hairstyles.
Representing the geographic extremes north and south.
Right, visually emphasizing this supposed coming together under Roman power. The arena provides a unifying experience, even if it's, well, maybe superficial.
And there's that vivid detail about the showers of saffron.
Yeah, linked to the arena's ability to recreate different environments and sensory experiences, like a 4D cinema precursor.
But the analysis importantly points out that even these exotic elements, like saffron, once integral to the cultures they came from, are now just consumed within the Roman spectacle. Divorced from their original context, they are no longer truly their own.
That's a crucial observation. Compare this with, say, Pliny the Elder's more idealized vision of imperial Italy unifying diverse peoples through common speech and Roman civilization.
A more organic unity.
Whereas Marshall's depiction of the arena offers a different kind of unification, a universal language of enthusiastic applause and acclamation for the emperor, a shared experience of the spectacle that transcends cultural differences, but perhaps at the cost of those differences themselves.
So the key insight is how the Roman spectacle transformed diverse cultures into elements of its own performance, reinforcing Roman centrality.
Exactly. The arena isn't just a physical place, it's a powerful mechanism for rearranging the world in Rome's image, like Speculum 4 seems to suggest.
Right, where the crowd that was deemed a threat to public peace is literally expelled into the arena, which then symbolically represents the empire's remote, less civilized regions.
Exactly. The amphitheater becomes this symbolic space that stands for all other places, unum pro cunctis. It's a way of geographically and socially reordering the empire within a controlled environment, simulating a kind of poetic justice where those who disrupted the peace are relegated to the periphery, at least symbolically.
Playing with inside and outside, center and periphery.
Absolutely. These reversible conceits, outside becomes inside, one stands for all, and all become one, under the emperor's gaze.
And Marshall even weaves myth into the spectacle, often in a way that feels surprisingly irreverent. The example of the informer being cast as an anti-Aeneas in Speculum 5 is really striking.
It is, isn't it? Aeneas, the legendary founder of Rome, figure of immense piety, heroic stature, completely inverted here.
So the informer, condemned and banished to the arena, becomes the antithesis of Aeneas's epic journey.
Exactly. And it's the Emperor Titus who now shoulders the pious burden, the impensis, the cost of these grand spectacles. The analysis suggests this might offer a subtle polemical contrast with the Julio-Claudian dynasty's emphasis on their deep, mythical, and divine ancestry.
So the Flavians, lacking that long lineage, use spectacle as a substitute.
Perhaps, creating their own powerful visual narrative in the present, which leads to this intriguing idea of the inherent genius of the arena and the dissolution of what's been termed aura, particularly in Speculum 14 and 15.
Ah, the ones describing the graphic scene of a pregnant sow being pierced by a hunter's spear. Pretty grim.
Very. And in these epigrams, the periphrasis Caesar's hunt, Diana, evolves to express the ambiguous nature of Diana herself, simultaneously goddess of the hunt and protector of childbirth. That inherent contradiction is highlighted by the violent spectacle.
And then there's the clever pun in Speculum 16 playing on casibus, which can mean both falls or chances, and ingenium, which can mean both birth or genius.
Right, seemingly celebrating the unexpected and prolific outcome of this violent event, the sheer number of piglets suddenly appearing.
That exclamation, O quantum est subitis casibus ingenium.
It simultaneously elevates and maybe trivializes the event. It marvels at the sudden, almost accidental genius of nature and the spectacle's ability to produce such a surprising outcome, while also underscoring the fleeting, ephemeral nature of the spectacle itself.
And the sequence of increasingly shorter epigrams culminates in this epigrammatic epiphany of the arena's shocking wonder, while also reflecting the epigram's own capacity to be both concise yet impactful.
It's like the arena spectacle transforms the natural order into something simultaneously wondrous and somehow commonplace, the key insight being how spectacle could reshape even biological reality.
It's almost as if the arena is trying to outdo myth, to confirm its power but ultimately replace it as the source of wonder, reducing traditional narratives to mere fama, just they say.
Yeah, that parallel we mentioned earlier to epic movies recreating the past and making original artifacts seem odiose or unnecessary. It's really striking here.
It highlights how the immersive power of spectacle can reshape, even supplant, our relationship with history and myth.
It absolutely can. Now let's consider the rather disturbing connection that Marshall sometimes draws between criminals in the arena and well-known figures from mythology.
Right, some of his poems actually directly identify these condemned criminals with heroic victims from popular myths during the arena performances. That poem about the criminal crucified in the role of Laureolus in Speculum 9 is a particularly vivid example.
Ah, Laureolus. He was a legendary robber whose dramatic execution was the subject of a very popular and sensational mime performance, known for its gruesome special effects.
So the arena execution wasn't just a punishment. It was also, in a sense, a real-life reenactment of a play about an execution.
Exactly, bringing the whole cycle of representation full circle in a rather unsettling way. A snuff mime, almost.
Grim. And in the poem, Marshall explicitly compares this crucified criminal who gets attacked by a bear to Prometheus.
Yes, Prometheus, the Titan in Greek mythology, famously chained to a rock, tormented by an eagle as punishment for stealing fire, a symbol of defiance.
And this is where the analysis suggests things get particularly interesting and potentially subversive, right?
It does. This explicit comparison to Prometheus, a figure often seen as a heroic rebel against tyrannical power, has inconvenient implications. From a Foucauldian perspective, it could inadvertently cast the criminal in the arena as a kind of heroic figure resisting oppressive authority.
Which was almost certainly not the intended message of these imperial spectacles.
Highly unlikely. And that earlier example of Pompey's elephants, where the Roman audience surprisingly felt pity for the suffering animals, it reminds us that audience reactions to these spectacles could be unpredictable, not always in line with the intended imperial narrative.
So the spectacle's attempts to reinforce power could sometimes generate unintended interpretations, even sympathy for the condemned. That's fascinating.
It really is. It makes you wonder about the intended impact versus the actual reception. And then there's the connection drawn between the spectacle and traditional Roman virtue, illustrated by the story of Mucius Scaevola.
The guy who burned his own hand off.
Exactly. The famous story of Mucius Scaevola, who bravely thrust his right hand into a burning brazier to demonstrate Roman courage and resolve to the Etruscan king Porsena. It was a powerful and frequently cited exemplum, a model of traditional Roman military virtue.
Enduring pain, sacrificing your body, terrifying the enemy.
Precisely. And the arena, in a way, served an ongoing educative role in cultivating and reinforcing this particular brand of stoicism and valor in the Roman populace, or so the elite hoped.
The analysis points out that the Roman public, by witnessing the often brutal violence of the arena, essentially congratulates itself on being able to endure sights that even a foreign enemy king like Porcina couldn't bear to watch in Mucius's demonstration.
It's a way for the Romans to collectively celebrate their supposed descent from this legendary figure of unwavering courage and self-control. We can take it.
Livy's historical account of Mucius Scaevola is particularly insightful here, isn't it? He portrays King Porcina as an almost internal spectator, who initially cannot stomach the sheer display of Roman resolve.
Which highlights how the Roman audience, by contrast, defined itself by its presumed capacity to witness such extreme acts. The story becomes a touchstone for Roman identity.
And Livy's narrative also includes key themes, like mistaken identity. Mucius initially kills Porcina's scribe by accident.
Right, adding a layer of almost tragic irony.
And this strong sense of an undifferentiated Roman virtue. Mucius proudly declares he's just one of many Roman citizens equally willing to die for Rome, emphasizing collective identity and unwavering loyalty.
Indeed. Mucius essentially turns the tables on Porcina. By demonstrating his utter contempt for his own physical body, he forces Porcina to express a wish that such extraordinary courage were at his disposal. In a subtle twist, this almost makes Mucius a deserter in a new metaphorical sense. His valor is so exceptional, it seems almost wasted on his own side, from Porcina's envious perspective.
So how does Martial, writing centuries later, actually use these traditional exemplars, these established models of Roman virtue? It seems he often revises or reinterprets them.
He does so in quite nuanced ways. His juxtaposition of figures like Caesar and Brutus, for instance, subtly traces a historical line from the Republic to the present Flavian dynasty, but with the implicit understanding that Caesar has evolved. It's more of a symbolic title of imperial power now, not necessarily a direct familial connection for the Flavians.
And figures like Mucius Scaevola get reduced.
Often, yes. Reduced to their most iconic attribute, their logo, in a sense, the permanently burned hand. It simplifies the complex narrative and maybe its moral weight.
It's almost as if Martial is taking these very powerful and complex historical figures and boiling them down to easily digestible symbols, perhaps even deliberately defanging their more politically challenging associations or their original context.
That's a plausible reading. The comparison to modern cinema, often reducing complex historical periods to a superficial period look, as Jameson puts it, is quite apt here.
It highlights this tendency in representation to flatten historical nuance and focus on easily recognizable, often visual, signifiers. And when we look at Martial's treatment of the Republican ideal of libertas, freedom of speech, we see that prominent figures associated with that era, like Cato the Younger, are notably diminished at the beginning of his overtly imperial era work.
Right. Cato, who became this ultimate symbol of principled anti-imperial resistance, his dramatic suicide at Utica was such a powerful statement against Caesarism, but Martial seems to, well, downplay his significance.
Why do you think that is?
Well, Martial explicitly states that his poetic policy is to respect living persons. He draws a contrast with earlier, more overtly satirical poets like Lucilius, who were known for naming individuals directly in their critiques.
So he's playing it safer.
Arguably. Martial claims that he values poetic fame at a lesser price than such direct confrontation, and that he prioritizes cleverness and wit over outright, fearless political critique. This embrace of the playful truth of words, this willingness to engage in more generalized satire and even obscenity, it becomes a kind of lesser form of libertas compared to the more politically charged outspokenness of the late Republic.
It's interesting how he then handles these other iconic heroic suicides like those of Arria and Portia. They seem to be celebrated in his epigrams.
They are.
Yet they exist alongside this more muted treatment, even subtle mockery, perhaps, of Cato. It suggests a shifting set of values, doesn't it?
Indeed. While Martial does expand upon Arya's famous utterance where she presented her husband with the dagger and famously said, "Pitus, it doesn't hurt."
Yeah, iconic moment.
The analysis suggests that Martial's version subtly shifts the focus towards tenderness and understanding between husband and wife, rather than the original's almost stern admonishment and call to action.
Softening the edges.
Perhaps. And the echo of the phrase "si qua fides," if there is any trust in the poem addressed to Aulus Martialis, urging him to seize the day and live for the present, further highlights this contrast between the heroic, self-sacrificing past and a more pragmatic, accommodating present. The context and the emphasis have clearly shifted.
And the way Martial juxtaposes seemingly disparate figures. like the notoriously stingy host in one epigram,
Yeah, Warburton 20.
with the illustrious suicidal hero Mucius Scaevola, and the very next one, 1.21, followed immediately by a poem about the grand arena spectacle in 1.22.
Right, that sequence is amazing.
It really shows how the immediate context dramatically alters the meaning and impact of these figures, doesn't it? The lone figure who becomes the cynosure of all eyes can be a contemptible, greedy banqueter or a courageous national hero.
And the emperor ultimately becomes the good host of the public spectacle, reassuring and entertaining the crowd, bringing order even to lions and hares. The very meaning of defiance, of public display, and of what constitutes praiseworthy behavior shifts dramatically depending on the specific context Martial creates. And always, there's the overarching presence of the emperor as the ultimate arbiter and editor of the public narrative.
Okay, let's explore a slightly different angle within Martial's work. This intriguing idea of the book itself as a kind of social actor in Roman society.
Yes, this is a really fun concept. Poems where the physical book seems to take on a social role, almost like a salutator. One of those clients who would make morning greetings to their patrons acting in place of Martial himself.
Like a little paper representative?
Pretty much. In Epigram 1.108, the book is explicitly sent to greet Gallus, who lives too far away from Martial to perform the customary morning visit in person. It's a symbolic act of social obligation.
There's another one.
Yeah. In 1.117, the book's convenient availability at the bookstore is presented as saving Lupercus's slave a long and inconvenient journey to fetch a copy. The book becomes a kind of mobile stand-in for the author.
It really highlights this peculiar status of the book in Roman culture, doesn't it? Not just as a passive collection of poems, but as a kind of active extension of the author's presence, capable of navigating social interactions, at least symbolically.
It plays a role in the etiquette of gift exchange, and even in the more practicalities of commercial transactions. The book has agency in a weird way.
Which leads to that fascinating connection between slaves and the book within Martial's work.
Right. Lupercus's slave, in the example we just discussed, almost seems to materialize from the various metaphors of servitude that Martial uses to describe the book's relationship with its author and its readers. It's sent, it serves, it obeys.
And then there's that rather unusual non-epitaph that appears at the very beginning of Book 1, seemingly for Martial himself.
Very strange placement.
And the later, more conventional epitaphs written for actual slaves. It's as if the figure of the slave, in a way, comes to represent the master's books, achieving a form of lasting presence, a kind of literary immortality within them.
That's a compelling interpretation. The poignant farewell addressed to the scribe Demetrius can be read as the poet symbolically relinquishing the mortal, physical aspects of his poetry, the labor of its creation and transcription.
Letting go of the physical manifestation.
Conversely, the figure of manumission, the freeing of a slave that appears in another poem, 1.52, reflects the poet's assertion of his creative control over his released poetry. Though the confidence expressed in the actual epitaph for Demetrius stands in contrast to the more tentative non-epitaph for Martial himself.
So these slave epitaphs can even be seen as synecdochic, representing the whole genre.
The analysis suggests that, yeah, both occupying a somewhat lower social or literary status compared to more prestigious forms like epic or tragedy. And look at the epitaph for Alcimus 1.88. The living garden contrasts with falling marble monuments. It adapts a common metapoetic idea about the immortality of poetry, but applies it to this humble slave figure.
So Martial uses the figure of the slave to explore themes of mortality, artistic legacy, and the very nature of his own poetic craft. That's incredibly insightful.
It really adds depth.
Okay, shifting gears again slightly. Let's explore the nuances of giving and refusing as they appear in Martial's epigrams. Seems to be a recurring motif, particularly around romantic and financial requests. It wasn't always a straightforward yes or no, was it?
Not at all. There's this almost miniature narrative cycle formed by poems 4.71 and 4.81, which revolve around a chaste young woman's polite refusal of Martial's romantic advances. He then playfully complains that he had merely asked her to refuse, not to flatly deny him any possibility. It highlights a kind of social dance around giving and withholding, where the manner of refusal can be as important as the refusal itself.
The art of letting someone down gently, or not.
Exactly. And then there's this recurring figure who seems to exist in a state of perpetual indecision, neither explicitly granting nor outright denying various requests.
Like who?
Whether it's a financial loan from Phoebus in 6.20, a loan or gift from Cinna in 7.43, or even the rather blunt request for free sex from an older woman in 7.75. This ambiguity seems to create a kind of deliberate suspense, maybe even torment, for the asker. Just tell me yes or no.
And Marshall links sex and money here.
Often, yes. He even employs a clever pun on the Latin verb dare, meaning to give, to subtly link the concepts of sexual and financial generosity within his poems. And that rather direct line from 12.91, whoever refuses nothing, Adicilla is a fellator, serves as a stark example of this conflation between sexual and financial refusal and the social judgments attached to both.
Wow, okay. So refusal itself is a complex act.
And the alternative interpretation of the punchline in 4.71 that the chase girl doesn't actually refuse Marshall outright, but simply doesn't offer her affections freely, adds yet another layer of complexity. Maybe she's just negotiating the price. The key takeaway is that in Marshall's world, refusal wasn't always absolute. It could be a form of social negotiation in itself.
It's fascinating to contrast Marshall's seemingly lighthearted, even humorous approach to these complex social negotiations with someone like Pliny. As we discussed earlier, Pliny is constantly preoccupied with how his actions might be perceived, particularly within the intricate world of literary patronage.
Exactly. Pliny's deep anxiety about potentially appearing self-serving or overly transactional in his relationships with patrons is quite palpable in his letters. He worries constantly.
Whereas
Marshall, perhaps because he doesn't cultivate the same image of lofty moral virtue and artistic independence, can afford to be more irreverent and direct, even turning his wit upon himself. He doesn't seem to have the same kind of carefully constructed social image to constantly protect.
less to lose, perhaps.
Or just a different personality, a different strategy. This inherent irreverence seems to tie directly into Marshall's distinctive use of praise and blame, this principle of variatio we see throughout his work.
Right, the analysis mentions polarity as a common structuring device. Like in Book 14, where he alternates between descriptions of the possessions of the wealthy and the meager belongings of the poor.
Yes, he frequently oscillates between assuming dominant and subordinate positions in his poems, and between employing the sharp tools of satire and invective on one hand, and offering elaborate expressions of panegyric or praise on the other.
A mix-and-match approach.
And the judicious mixing of both flattery and abuse was actually a recognized and even valued rhetorical strategy in Roman society. It showed range, maybe kept people on their toes, and Marshall directly addresses the potentially jealous reader who cannot bear to hear others being praised in Epigram 1.40.
Which comes right after.
A poem praising Decianus. This highlights the delicate balance he had to strike. The key insight is that Marshall's poetry often functioned by creating these contrasts, using both praise and blame to define social roles and values.
And how does this dynamic of praise and blame play out when it comes to the emperor himself? You might assume it would be all unwavering praise all the time, given the power dynamics.
Not entirely, which is interesting. In the preface to Book 8, which is dedicated to Emperor Domitian, Marshall explicitly explains his deliberate inclusion of both expressions of pietas, dutiful respect towards the emperor, alongside more lighthearted jests.
So he flags it up front.
He does. He even notes the relative scarcity of overtly obscene content in these emperor-centric books like 5 and 8, suggesting a conscious effort to maintain a certain level of decorum befitting the subject matter.
But even within those books dedicated to the emperor, there are still hints of Marshall's characteristic wit and irreverence, right? Like that little joke about Myrtle attempting to mask her wine-soaked breath with the scent of laurel in Book 5.
Exactly. Still poking fun, even gently. And the striking juxtaposition found in Book 6, which places a poem about Fabula's obviously bought and artificial hair right next to a respectful epigram about a noble statue of Julia.
Yeah, talk about contrast.
It really underscores the contrasting tones and the poet's seemingly arbitrary power to shift between them, often employing a direct interrogative, who would believe, to highlight the absurdity of one situation against the idealized image of the other.
This idea of stark juxtaposition as a source of poetic interest, almost an attraction of opposites, really comes through in that sequence involving Priapus, Cinemacina, and Solanus in Book 6.
Oh yeah, that's a great example. It vividly illustrates the seemingly arbitrary power of the poet to interpret and present figures in either a highly positive or decidedly negative light, sometimes with little apparent reason.
Cinna's gets hammered, right?
He does. His name is deliberately shortened to Cinna, and this linguistic alteration is harshly castigated as a barbarismus, a grammatical error considered so egregious that it supposedly strips him of his perceived status as freeborn.
Just for shortening his name. Wow.
compared to the almost deifying treatment of Salonius, who is elevated to a sacred shade, and even the image of the humble ant being preserved forever in precious amber, a seemingly random act of poetic elevation. It really highlights the poet's role as a kind of social and literary judge, wielding language like a weapon or a blessing.
It really underscores the poet's seemingly whimsical power to bestow or withhold value and status. And sometimes it seems Marshall delights in directly playing with his audience's expectations and the conventions of gift-giving, like in Epigram 11.57.
Ah, where he sends a collection of his poetry to Severus despite also having invited him to dinner.
Right. It kind of makes you wonder what kind of gift Severus was actually anticipating. Maybe something more substantial than poems.
It's a subtle but pointed jab, isn't it? At the often transactional nature of social exchanges and the implied expectations surrounding invitations and reciprocal gestures,
Mm.
did you expect party favors?
Huh. Okay, let's return briefly to the recurring motif of slavery in Marshall's work. This time focusing on how slaves are often used as a lens through which to frame and comment on the complex dynamics of social relations between free Roman citizens.
Right. The analysis suggests that slaves in Marshall's poems sometimes function as a kind of substitute humanity, allowing the free to explore relationships that parallel their own but operate under a different set of rules and power dynamics.
And other times.
Other times, slaves appear as an almost infiltrating presence, subtly complicating and challenging the supposedly clear boundaries of the free world.
We see these quite contradictory perspectives on the roles of husbands and slave boys within the seemingly parallel structures of marriage and servitude in Epigrams 12.96 and 12.97, don't we?
Absolutely. The clever wordplay on fugitiva, a female runaway slave, and a redempta, a female slave who has been bought back, applied to marital fidelity, really highlights this inherent tension and blurring of boundaries between the institution of marriage and the pervasive reality of slavery in Roman society.
It seems to suggest that the constant awareness of individuals being bought and sold through slavery inevitably casts a shadow. It complicates the supposedly free and equal relationships meant to exist between citizens, particularly within marriage. The power dynamics are always lurking.
Precisely. You can't fully separate the two spheres. Now let's consider the dynamic between poets, their patrons, and the underlying structures of power that shape their relationships. Epigram 11.3 presents a rather transactional view. Marshall's book is depicted as actively seeking out statues to be erected in honor of potential patrons, in direct exchange for the promise of poetic immortality bestowed by Marshall's verse.
A very direct quid pro quo, a statue for eternal fame.
Exactly. But then, in the very next poem, 11.4, Marshall directly petitions Emperor Domitian for the Megasis Trium Liberorum.
The legal right of 3 children, which conferred certain privileges.
Right. And he explicitly appeals to the emperor's power to grant even that which fortune itself withholds. It's a clear acknowledgement of supreme imperial authority.
So, contrast there.
But what's particularly fascinating is the implicit parallel that's drawn here between the act of making a god through votive offerings and petitions and the power of the poet to ensure the lasting reputation of the great through his verses. It subtly suggests that the poet, in his own way, holds a certain degree of power.
The power to shape public memory, bestow literary immortality even upon the emperor.
Exactly, a sort of soft power, perhaps?
And Marshall himself actually receives the Evus Trium Liberorum as a direct reward for his poetic achievements, doesn't he? It's documented in 2.91 and 2.92.
He does. And there's a neat connection made to the end of Book 2, anticipating Book 3 as his metaphorical third child, fulfilling the legal requirement.
Huh. Very clever. It firmly reinforces this idea of the poet's creative work possessing tangible social and even legal value within Roman society.
Absolutely. Now, let's consider Marshall's relationship with his wider reading public. The analysis suggests that the experience of Ovid's exile poetry significantly influenced Marshall's conception of his own audience.
Oh, so Ovid was banished, Marshall wasn't.
Right, so rather than envisioning his audience primarily as a small, select circle of personal connections and aristocratic patrons, like maybe earlier poets did, Marshall seems to have conceived of a much broader, more diverse reading public, reached primarily through the circulation of his published books, like Ovid writing back to Rome from afar.
Ah, reaching a public through the book itself.
Yes, this expanded public is the one that buys his books, that makes him a recognizable figure, almost a celebrity of his time, even if his poetic output wasn't always regarded as the most highbrow literature.
So there's this implied commercial contract between Marshall and his readers.
Seems so. A mutual exchange of entertainment, wit, maybe even that subversive social commentary. The Lucan epigram, 14.194, where the opinion of the local bookseller is presented as validating his status as a true poet.
Not some literary critic, but the guy selling the books.
Exactly. It really underscores this reliance on a wider reading audience for his literary standing. The marketplace becomes a key site of literary validation for him.
It's as if the act of purchasing and reading his work becomes the ultimate form of patronage, in a way.
That's a good way to put it. And the actual physical act of reading itself plays a role in shaping this relationship, right? The emergence of the codex format, the bound book.
Easier to handle in scrolls.
And the image Marshall presents of the reader casually holding the book with just one hand. It suggests a more personal, maybe more portable reading experience.
And he even addresses women readers directly sometimes.
Absolutely. He playfully and directly addresses his female readers in certain poems, particularly in Book 3, Epigrams 3.6869. It suggests a more intimate and perhaps less formally gendered engagement with his work than might have been the case with earlier forms of literary consumption, implying a broader and more diverse readership.
Okay, now let's delve into how Marshall engages with his own poetic predecessors. Catullus, the lyric poet of the late Republic, seems to be a particularly significant figure in this intertextual dialogue.
Oh, hugely significant. Marshall frequently inverts, alludes to, and otherwise plays with the themes, language, and structures found in Catullus's poetry.
Like the invitation poem.
That's a prime example. The direct comparison between Catullus's famous invitation poem, Carmen 13, and Marshall's own invitation in 3.12. Marshall, the self-proclaimed professional poet making his living from his writing, almost seems to deliberately outmaneuver the deceased Catullus, shifting the focus from poetic ideals and passionate declarations to the more pragmatic realities of material concerns and social obligation. He even ribs his invitee for expecting too much, for transgressing a poetics of slightness.
It's as if Marshall is deliberately bringing Catullus's intensely personal and often amatory language back down to earth, into the more prosaic sphere of amictia, friendship, social connection, even patronage.
Right. The romantic intensity is replaced by a more calculated social exchange. And Marshall makes similar nuanced distinctions between Beneville wishing someone well and a mare to love someone romantically.
Echoing Catullus again.
Exactly, echoing Catullus's exploration of these themes, but firmly placing them within the context of patronage and social obligation in poems like 2.54.
And Ovid. We mentioned them earlier.
Yes, he also makes pointed allusions to the exile poetry of Ovid, but often with a subtle undertone highlighting his own more fortunate position of being within imperial favor rather than banished.
A bit cheeky, perhaps.
Maybe. He cleverly recycles Ovid's frequent theme of geographical distance as a different kind of distance, that between a mere citizen and the almost divine emperor, effectively giving it a panegyrical, emperor-flattering twist. The key insight here is that Marshall actively positions himself within and against the traditions of Roman poetry, redefining those traditions within the context of his own time and his professionalized approach to his craft.
This is all incredibly illuminating. And then there's this really intriguing 17th century development, Johannes Burmeister's Martialis Christianus.
Ah, Burmeister. A fascinating footnote, or maybe more than a footnote.
A project that attempts to redeem Marshall's often quite saucy and secular epigrams by ingeniously transforming them into Christian devotional material. It's a wild case of cultural reappropriation.
It is a truly remarkable and somewhat audacious project. Burmeister's stated aim was to combat idleness and to cure what he saw as the inherent sins present in Marshall's original poems by repurposing them for Christian edification. A significant act of recontextualization and moral transformation.
He even wrote a two-part apologia, a formal defense of Marshall, didn't he? Trying to reframe him as a kind of proto-moral satirist who is simply responding to decadent times, while also justifying his own rather radical project.
Exactly. A bit of having his cake and eating it too, perhaps. And the specific examples of Burmeister's parodies are quite striking. He systematically transforms references to Roman deities into their Christian equivalents.
Like Rex Diorum becomes God.
Right. Replaces the pursuit of earthly fame with the promise of salvation through the crucifixion. Reimagines the Roman imperial court as a Christian court in the afterlife. It's a wholesale theological repurposing of Marshall's witty verses.
He even added marginal notes pointing to Scripture.
Yes. Directly guiding readers to relevant passages, further anchoring his Christianized Marshall within a religious framework. And his parody of Marshall's epigram complaining about his own rubbish poems, Quas nec ipse eam novi, is particularly clever. He contrasts the original's faux despair about his trivial works not being allowed to perish, peri non licet meis nugis, with the Christian hope of resurrection, a complete inversion of meaning.
And his take on the Viste Coli epigram, Martial 2.55.
Which originally dealt with a somewhat demanding individual's expectation of being constantly praised. Burmeister retains much of Martial's original phrasing, but imbues it with this almost Catullin intensity of emotional devotion, now directed towards the Christian God.
Wow, it's a fascinating example of how Burmeister attempts to retain Martial's poetic skill while completely redirecting its devotional focus.
Which raises a really interesting question, doesn't it? Did Burmeister truly manage to redeem Martial? Or do Martial's original epigrams, with their inherent irreverence and worldly focus, perhaps inadvertently offer their own kind of subtle parody of the very Christian message Burmeister sought to impose upon them?
So does Martial undermine Burmeister from beyond the grave?
It's debatable. It highlights the enduring ambiguity and adaptability of Martial's work across vastly different cultural and religious landscapes.
It certainly does. It underscores the enduring power and the surprising adaptability of Martial's epigrams, allowing them to be reinterpreted and repurposed across centuries and within entirely different contexts.
Indeed, it speaks to the fundamental human concerns that Martial addressed: social climbing, dealing with power, the nature of art, giving and refusing, even if his solutions and perspectives differed dramatically from those of later interpreters.
Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating and truly deep dive into the world of Martial. We've explored his incredibly keen observations on Roman social rules and the relentless pursuit of social mobility,
The pervasive and complex role of public spectacle in Roman life.
and the intricate relationships between the poet, his poetry, and his diverse reading public.
What's truly remarkable, I think, is how Martial's world, though separated from our own by over 2 millennia, still manages to resonate so powerfully with our contemporary experiences. Navigating complex social dynamics, the constant bombardment of information, the overwhelming presence of spectacle.
It feels surprisingly modern sometimes.
His insights into human nature and the workings of society seem to have a timeless quality.
They really do. And it leaves you with a significant thought, doesn't it? Consider how the various spectacles of our own time, from the curated realities of social media to the constant stream of entertainment and the 24/7 news cycle.
How do they shape our own perceptions of reality, power, and social status?
Exactly. Perhaps echoing in surprising ways the very dynamics that Martial so acutely observed within the grand Roman arena.
It's definitely food for thought.
Absolutely. And if you're intrigued to delve even deeper, we highly recommend exploring Martial's epigrams themselves and the insightful scholarly works we've touched upon today. You might be genuinely surprised at just how much a poet from ancient Rome can still tell us about ourselves and the world we inhabit.